Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Andy Linehan, President of the City Club. Welcome to our Friday Forum and a presentation by Secretary of State Bill Bradbury on elections in Oregon. Before we begin, I have our usual announcements. Next Friday, of course, is the Friday after Thanksgiving. We'll have no program. I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. The following Friday, December 5th, we'll have the next in our series called Keeping Oregon's Promise, and this time the topic is going to be building community. And our speakers that day will be Father Mike Maslowski, Tony Hobson, and Doug Stam. Ethan Seltzer will be moderating as usual. You can reserve through the City Club offices or talk to staff today. On Monday, Monday coming up, we're going to celebrate the 30th anniversary of women joining City Club. And that event will take place on the first floor of City Hall at 5:30 to 7. And come join Mayor Katz, Gretchen Kafuri, Pauline Anderson, and others. And we're going to celebrate with music from 1973, as well as great food and drink, and also some juicy quotes from the newspapers and the arguments of the time. It's very interesting. There'll also be hors d'oeuvres provided with support from Voila Catering. So please RSVP to the front to the office, Colin or Nikki, and we look forward to seeing you there. As you know, the annual fund drive is continuing. We have 288 members who've contributed this year. We're about two-thirds of the way towards our goal, so it would be a great time for you to pick up the envelope on your table and make a contribution to City Club for the end of this year. Broadcast of City Club programs this month are made possible in part with underwriting from Pacificor, CH2M Hill, and Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. We are grateful for their support. So on to our program. For many years, elections were one of those things that Americans took for granted. If we hadn't exactly invented democratic elections, certainly we were the world's experts on how to do it. The 2000 presidential elections destroyed that illusion and called into question our expertise in introducing democratic institution overseas in such places as Iraq. In Oregon, we've had our own twists and turns as we've jousted over how ballot measure and referendum elections are held, and as we've defunded and then refunded the voters' pamphlet. Our speaker today is really at the heart of the Oregon elections process and efforts to improve it. Bill Bradbury was appointed Secretary of State in November 1999 and was elected to a 4-year term in November 2000. As the state's second highest ranking constitutional officer, Bradbury is the Auditor of Public Accounts, he's the Chief Elections Officer, and he's manager of the state's official legislative and executive records. Along with the Governor and State Treasurer, Bradbury oversees management of the state-owned lands as a member of the State Land Board. From 1995 to 1999, Bradbury served as Executive Director for the Sake of the Salmon, a Portland-based nonprofit organization which is dedicated to finding common ground for salmon restoration throughout the West Coast. Bill Bradbury served in the Oregon legislature for 14 years, serving as Senate Majority Leader from 1986 to 1993 and as Senate President from 1993 to 1995. Please welcome Bill Bradbury.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really am honored to get a chance to participate in the Friday forums. I've been here before, and to me, the Portland City Club is a special place for a number of reasons. First, they allow women. That's great. Second, here you thoroughly explore the real issues that affect Oregon. Here you look for underlying causes and are not satisfied with simplistic explanations. And here you want real solutions and are committed to real action to achieve those solutions. In fact, there's really no better place than the City Club for the topic that I'd like to talk to you about today. You see, there really is a shadow that has fallen over the election system in our country. Elections are all about confidence. Confidence that our votes will be counted. Confidence that secrecy will be maintained and confidence that the results that we get are in fact true and accurate. That confidence is what gives leaders the legitimacy to govern. Now, I think all of us know that our confidence has been shaken in the election process at all levels. We see it in many ways, from declining voter turnout to ineffective campaign reform to recall politics. And our confidence in the election system received its largest jolt in the 2000 presidential election. Americans were exposed to the fact that our electoral system was held together by tape and string, and in some counties, baling wire. And it was using outdated equipment and outmoded procedures. And it became crystal clear to all of us watching CNN that night that a handful of partisans in county government were making decisions that would determine who would be the President of the United States. We had a candidate's brother who was governor of a key state. We had suspicious punch card ballots. And the final decision was made by the U.S. Supreme Court, with 3 of the justices on that court appointed by the candidate's father. Now, it sounds more like a third world country than it does sound like the world's leading democracy. As never before, America became aware, as playwright Tom Stoppard put it, that it's not the voting that's democracy, it's the counting. Now, the good news is that America held true to the force of law and honored the process. Under similar circumstances, not every country would have done what America did. And it was Americans' fundamental confidence in our system and our laws that has allowed President Bush to govern despite all the questions about how he was elected. However, it was clear that there were problems with both voting systems and voter access. Congress addressed both of these kinds of problems by passing a comprehensive act called the Help America Vote Act. It's known as HAVA, and they passed that in October of 2002. HAVA makes sweeping reforms to the nation's elections process. Its 3 primary requirements are, number 1, ensuring that disabled Americans have the right to participate in elections with independence and with privacy. Number 2, HAVA requires getting rid of punch cards nationwide. And number 3, HAVA requires states to develop centralized voter registration systems. Thanks to Senators Wyden and Senator Smith, HAVA does not, underline not, change our vote-by-mail system. However, it will improve the integrity of Oregon's voting process, and it will make visible changes in the process for many Oregon voters. Although the initial funding has been approved by the Congress, President Bush continues to undermine and delay the HAVA system. The president dragged his feet for nearly a year before appointing the HAVA commission that's required by law that implements the HAVA Act. This delay means that Oregon has still not been able to collect $9.9 million of HAVA money for the last fiscal year, which ended nearly 2 months ago. Pressure from the White House caused congressional conferees to cut the $1.5 billion of HAVA money approved in a large bipartisan vote in the Senate. They cut that HAVA money from $1.5 billion to $500 million this year. As a result of these and other actions, the HAVA reforms will not be in place by the 2004 election, in most states. We could conceivably have the same scenario in the 2004 presidential election that we had in 2000. And I, for one, find that really unconscionable. Our crisis in confidence didn't end with the 2000 election. As much as I wish I could say, well, that was then, and now is now, the reality is an unprecedented level of media scrutiny has attended the recent gubernatorial and local elections in other states. And now, confidence has even been shaken in some of the HAVA reforms. You've probably seen the news reports about problems some computer security experts have identified with touchscreen voting. Those devices have been questioned, and many of you may have heard about the CEO of Diebold Incorporated, which makes lots of these devices. He stated in a Republican fundraising letter that he is, and this is a quote, he is committed to helping Ohio deliver its electoral votes to the president next year, end quote. Now, Ohio, at that moment, was on the verge of adopting Diebold voting machines. So people feared that he might be able to, in fact, keep his promise regardless of how the people voted. But whether it's counting votes in Florida, decreased funding and delays in HAVA reform, or tampering with touchscreens as a voting device, national confidence in the elections process has slipped drastically. Now, Oregon has its concerns as well. Last regular session of the Oregon legislature, the legislature played politics with the voters pamphlet. They played politics with general elections reform that are needed, and they played politics even with vote by mail. Many of you will be aware that despite 100 years of vital service to the elections process, the voters pamphlet is still not fully funded for this election cycle. Now, knowing how difficult the state's fiscal situation would be, I proposed at the beginning of the last session a bill to raise fees so that the voters pamphlet would in fact be self-supporting. My bill passed the Oregon Senate with bipartisan support, but on the last day of the session, the House Republican leadership added 69 pages of amendments to a one-page bill, and the effect of those amendments being added was it killed it for the session. These amendments that were added would have gutted Oregon's campaign finance reporting system. The amendments would have reduced the number of days that voters have to vote by mail, which would dramatically disadvantage not urban voters, not people here, but people living out in the country. Rural voters are disadvantaged when you shorten the time available to vote. And the amendments included several other things that the House Republicans could not get passed in the light of day. So they were all stuffed into one big bill. So the result was, when the legislature went home, they had not funded the voters pamphlet or even let it pay for itself, leaving Oregonians without what Jacob Lewin on Kink called an island of reason and balance in the maelstrom of Oregon politics. Now, I was clearly unwilling to accept the result that we not have a voters pamphlet, and so I fought hard to get the voters pamphlet money from the emergency board. And I'm happy to report that I did get the money for the voters pamphlet, at least for the 2004 primary so far. And I'll be back before the emergency board next year to get money for the general election voters pamphlet, and hopefully we'll make sure next session that there will be another 100 years of the voters pamphlet. Now, as I said, during the session I had to fight off attacks on the vote by mail system itself. There were repeated attempts to shorten the number of days voters had to vote, make it more difficult to drop off ballots in drop sites, and there were even attempts to stop people from voting on election night even if they were already in line by 8 o'clock. So those kind of political games were part of a concerted effort to subvert Oregon's elections process. But Oregon's vote-by-mail process, let's remember, Oregon's vote-by-mail process was initiated by the people in a clear majority, 3-1 majority. And it's a system that the voters asked for and that the voters are very happy with. A study this year by Priscilla Southwell, a professor at the University of Oregon, assessed the attitude that Oregonians have about vote by mail. That study concludes that after 5 years of use in all elections in Oregon, Oregonians overwhelmingly continue to support vote by mail, and that support is really independent of party, it's independent of age, it's independent of income. So nearly 1/3 of those surveyed, including women, the disabled, homemakers, and those aged 26 to 38, reported they were more likely to vote with vote by mail. There's no evidence that either party has an advantage due to this election system. Thanks to vote by mail, Oregon does not have the same concerns with touchscreen devices that other states, in fact, do have with touchscreen devices. As long as we vote by mail, obviously, we're not going to have touchscreens in every home. We're not going to mail touchscreens to every person, and we're going to have a paper-based ballot system in the state of Oregon. Touchscreens will be an option for voters that they can choose to use if they want to come to the county office, but they're not our only system, and I think that's the key. And I've decided that Oregon will not purchase any touchscreen device that does not produce a paper record of your vote at the time you vote. And the reason I've decided that is because we have a long tradition, and we have a law, by the way, that I proposed to the legislature in the 2001 session that requires hand recounts of elections if a recount is necessary. And today, the California Secretary of State, Kevin Shelley, held a press conference announcing that the touchscreen systems that were ordered in California were going to have to produce a paper ballot for each vote that was cast at the time it was cast, so that the person pushing the buttons on the screen could check how they voted. That was an announcement that made several counties in California not too happy, given that they've spent millions of dollars already on touchscreen vote machines that don't produce paper ballots. But that's the direction we're moving. Now, it's not just Oregon voters that prefer vote by mail. Other jurisdictions are discovering the popularity and the effectiveness of vote by mail as well. In Colorado, Boulder County found that vote by mail more than doubled voter turnout in Boulder County. After a number of municipal vote by mail elections, England has also decided to adopt vote by mail for all municipal elections. They too found that voter turnout increased and that people liked the method of voting. In fact, the British Electoral Commission warned against reinstating the old polling place system. They said that it would make the voters mad. It's obvious that vote by mail is preferred by voters, yet it is continually attacked by some politicians, and I think that's very unfortunate. The Oregon initiative system is also under a cloud. Oregon's leading initiative advocate, Bill Sizemore, was recently convicted for racketeering. The ban on paying per signature was passed last year by the voters by a 3-1 margin. People clearly felt that something in the system was not right, was amiss, but now some activists are suing in federal court to overturn this this initiative. Several episodes have left the impression that the will of the people as expressed in ballot measures is being ignored or contravened. Big money, out-of-state groups sponsoring petitions can lead to some real resentments on the part of Oregonians, and squabbles like last week's battle on the tax referendum petitions and now the lawsuit on ballot measure 26, which is the pay per signature ballot measure, discourage petition signers and potential voters. Only by restoring confidence and trust in elections can we remind the voters that our republic is a government of, by, and for the people. Perhaps the most disturbing indicator of a lack of confidence in government is the continuing drop in participation by people aged 18 to 25. According to a 2002 study, presidential election year voting by this group has consistently dropped for more than 30 years. In fact, that 30 years spans the time that 18-year-olds have been able to vote. And their participation was at a high the first year they got the vote, and it's declined every year since. Yet this is the generation that must be engaged. They've got to be involved. These are the decision makers in the next 20 years. The people under 18 today outnumber the baby boomers generation. They're the kids of the baby boomers. And there are more of them than there are baby boomers. And young people are, by and large, disengaged from the democratic system. A Harvard survey found that almost half of college students believed politics rarely has any immediate or tangible results. Ellen Goodman notes that many young people don't have faith that government affects them or that they can affect the government. It's not that this generation isn't involved. In fact, studies show that this same group that isn't voting excels in community and volunteer activities. They make the connection that such activities matter. But the same outlook doesn't hold true for elections. This is the central issue of trust. This generation raised on commercials and MTV is more likely to harbor skepticism and cynicism, and will be the first to remove themselves from consideration if we can't offer them the system that they find trustworthy. Young people especially don't believe they can trust the government or the political process to make the right decisions, to be honest, or to look out for the welfare of anyone who's not already in power. And this is the generation that must be politically engaged. Because young voters don't vote, I guess it's no surprise that they don't get the attention from campaigns that other groups get. When you do a poll of likely voters, the concerns of younger voters aren't really reflected in that poll because they're not the likely voters. And because they don't get the attention they deserve in elections from candidates, a lower percentage actually votes. And we go on and on and on in a really vicious cycle. Let me ask you, how do you govern a disinterested populace with no ownership in the political institutions that represent them? How do you ask these alienated young people to make sacrifices when sacrifices are necessary? Now, I realize at this point that you may be completely depressed. However, there are reasons for optimism. There are many things that each of us can do to restore voters' faith and voters' confidence. Nationally, the best election reform tool of this generation is found in the Help America Vote Act, in HAVA. It's HAVA that gets rid of punch cards and hanging chads. It's HAVA that creates a centralized voter registration system in each state. It's HAVA that makes sure that the disabled have equal access to a private ballot. We must fully fund HAVA so that states can address voter doubt and voter uncertainty. In Oregon, my overreaching goal under HAVA is to do as much as possible to improve Oregon's voters' experience with the electoral process. With improvements in the process and the experience, we hope that the confidence in elections will in fact return. Confidence in the way votes are counted and voters are accounted for is the bedrock of American democracy. HAVA goes a long way to restore that faith, and I would ask each of you to write your congressional representatives and insist that HAVA gets the money that they authorized but have not yet appropriated. Here in Oregon, talk to your legislators. Tell them that you want the voters' pamphlet fully funded, that something this crucial to the elections process should not be haphazardly funded or a pawn in some political game. Tell them that you don't want neutral, broadly supported bills to be held hostage by partisan politics anymore. Tell your representatives not to mess with vote by mail. My office is working closely with county officials to implement HAVA and implement the reforms that HAVA entails. I traveled across Oregon and held hearings to make sure that anyone who was interested got input into our elections plan. In fact, our election plan process that's mandated under HAVA has been a model for the entire nation. People from around the country have looked at how we did develop the election plan. Oregon vote by mail is about collaboration, not confrontation. The state and the counties are partners in this process. Perhaps the most important piece of it, and the one that will take the most work, is the Oregon Centralized Voter Registration Project. It will improve the integrity of voter registration information by combining 36 separate county voter registration databases into a single statewide database. This will ensure that voters can register in only one county, and it will speed updating information for voters who change their registration close to an election. We've made other progress under HAVA as well. Today, for the first time, I have the pleasure, and this is a true pleasure, I have the pleasure of announcing that no Oregonian will ever again use a punch card ballot in an Oregon election. Before we vote again, every county will have made the conversion to optical scan systems that are used in places like Multnomah County. Every county will have made the transition. So, in addition to phasing out punch cards, we've received grant money so that counties can improve physical access for voters with disabilities to their election site. The state and the counties are doing their part to increase voter faith and confidence. And you can help by learning more about the Oregon election plan and letting your county commissioners know that you support the implementation of that plan. Finally, I'd really make a plea to you to encourage young people to vote. I bet everyone here knows at least one, if not more than one, 18 to 24-year-old. If every adult persuaded one young person to vote, there would be no problem with voter turnout. Now, it may take some commitment, but getting young people to vote is definitely possible for everybody here. A 2002 study found that face-to-face interaction is the most important kind of interaction for this age group, and just one contact could significantly increase the probability of voting. So I would really encourage you to talk to people. Now, young people are especially persuaded by their peers, and we don't get to be their peers anymore, unfortunately. But even us older folks can, in fact, be persuasive, and what's really important is to have that conversation and to encourage that participation. My own experience suggests that young people just need to be educated about what a vote means and how to do it. I make it a point when I'm traveling around Oregon to stop at local high schools and conduct a mock election exercise. And just in the past 2 months, for example, we traveled over 2,000 miles around Oregon. Didn't ride in some nice motorhome, but we did travel around the state. And we've gone to more than a dozen high schools in communities all over the state. The exercise that we do with students is basically designed to emphasize that even though this is a big state, and even though there's a lot of people who could be voting, the reality is that a small number of voters, and they're mostly older voters, who actually make the decisions. And that's compared to the large number of folks who are affected by the decisions and care about the decisions, but they're not participating. And the whole point of the exercise is that at the end of the exercise is not me lecturing students. It's basically doing an exercise where we figure out who the voters are and go through, 75% of them are old enough to vote, and then 72% of them only register to vote, and then you go to a primary like a low turnout primary where 47% vote. So in a class of 60, you might have 10 people actually voting, which drives the other 50 kids pretty nuts. But the point is that the point of the exercise is to make it very clear that participation in the system is the only way your choices have a good chance of becoming a reality. And even if I conducted this exercise, if that's all I did every day from now on, it would never have the impact or reach the numbers that each of you can reach just by being a good example and a good teacher. Don't underestimate phone calls. Some of you with college-age children may be interested in a Yale study that was done in the November 2002 election that showed a single phone call to young voters significantly increased their turnout. A single phone call to young voters. What have we got? 75 phone calls that could be made here. That would significantly increase turnout of those voters. So parents, aunts, uncles, etc., need to call their kids and make sure they get an absentee ballot, and then make sure that they vote. Don't forget, obviously, to vote yourself. That's obvious. Your example does, in fact, send a message. If you can't be bothered to vote, why should anyone else be bothered? If you make a special point of voting, the message is clear to those around you, and that message is you care about political decisions, and maybe they should too. Talk to people you know who are not yet 18 about voting and elections and why they're important. The vote by mail ballot is really a valuable tool that parents should use with their kids to teach them about civics and reach them about elections. And it's a great opportunity to sit around the breakfast table and talk to your children as you mark your ballot about the issues in front of you. Studies show that young adults reared in a home with regular political discussions are 3 times more likely to be involved in various political activities. Think about that. 3 times more likely if they're in a home where there's regular political discussions. So if you think about it, election reform can and does happen everywhere, from the dinner table in your house to the Oval Office in the White House. We all have a part to play in this process. Now, as I conclude today, I'd like to reemphasize that we must restore confidence in the election system, both nationally and in Oregon. Although I believe the whole electorate is somewhat shaken by the events of the past 4 years, it is especially important to me to get young people re-engaged in the political process. They are clearly the decision makers of the future. They're the swing votes today. FDR once said, "Confidence thrives on honesty, on honor, on the sacredness of obligations, on faithful protection, and on unselfish performance. Without them, confidence cannot live." So don't fall for political gamesmanship. The partisan meddling with elections, and especially vote by mail, is dishonest, dishonorable, and ignores our obligations and selfishly exposes our most critical structures to cynicism and mistrust. So I'd ask you to do your part. Make sure legislators know how you feel. Tell them you want the HAVA reforms, you want the voters pamphlet, and you want a healthy vote-by-mail system. Also, vote and let people know how important it is to you that they vote as well. I, in turn, promise to do my part as Chief Elections Officer. I will keep the HAVA reforms rolling. I will keep fighting for funding the voters pamphlet, and I will continue to police the initiative process. And I'll make sure the legislature doesn't undermine vote by mail as much as I possibly can. It's time to appreciate the progress we've made, but attack the problems that remain. It's time to take action and restore confidence in elections in this country and in this state. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State Bill Bradbury, and we particularly want to thank you for stepping in. As you all know, Congressman Blumenauer had planned to speak here and wasn't able to, but this topic is both timely and something that's mattered to City Club for a long time. And I wanted to point out to you that we have copies of the 1996 study on the initiative and referendum system in Oregon, which is available, I think, at a cost of $3 at the back table, but it indicates that, this has been an issue that's mattered to City Club for quite a long time. As you know, a benefit of belonging to the City Club is the right to ask questions of our speakers. Our first questioner today will be our board host, Susan Kelly. She's the immediate past president of City Club, and she works in community outreach in the Portland Water Bureau. She also served on the staff of Commissioner Charlie Hales and has a long history in political and campaigns in Oregon. So after Susan has asked her question, other members of the audience who are City Club members, please come to the mic and ask your questions in 30 seconds, and please identify yourself as a City Club member. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Bill. That was a very good presentation, and I'm confident in you to keep on with this HAVA effort and support you for that.
Thank you.
The issue of confidence in government that you hit on many times and is pivotal, I think, to get the turnout and get the response. I'm wondering if in another aspect of the Secretary of State office, in your audit role, there is more that can be done, and can you sort of give us a little bit on the performance audit issue? Specifically, I'm thinking of funding staff, or because politically it's a hot point? Is it something that can be contracted out? And are there examples for like welfare reform that we can say, look, we are doing a good job. This is why we should have faith in government.
You've touched on one of the major functions of the Secretary of State is to be the Chief Elections Officer. Another major function that actually is specifically mentioned in the Constitution is to be the auditor of state accounts. And we do audits of state agencies on a regular basis. We do performance audits, which look both at proper fiscal spending, but also, are you getting done anything like what you wanted to get done, or what your goals were, and what the law says you should get done. The most recent audit we did that really showed some significant problems was an audit we conducted about a year ago on the Oregon State Lottery. We identified about $800,000 in expenditures that we didn't think were necessary. The lottery at the time said we just didn't understand the lottery, but the governor said, well, I don't think you understand your job as lottery, and replaced the lottery director and several of the deputies. So the new lottery director, Brenda Rockland, has been doing a marvelous job, and she's implemented 19 of the 21 recommendations we made to her, and the 2 other recommendations that we made are in the process of being implemented. The study that our audits division did went back a year later and basically identified that already the changes that Brenda Rockland has made have saved $500,000, $500,000 at the lottery. That's $500,000 that will be spent, instead of on, big lunches for lottery employees, will be spent on schools, will be spent on salmon, will be spent on parks, and will be spent on economic development. So that's the kind of example of the kinds of results we're getting from the audits division, and we're very happy to say that after some initial proposals during the last session to basically to eliminate the audits division, that didn't happen thanks to the Senate, the state Senate, and the audits division is continuing to function in a fully funded way. So I'm real happy about that.
Hello, Bill. Bill Parrish, City Club member. We recently had a PUD election, and there was an enormous news story that came out this week related to PG being bought by a Texas firm. It's a very colorful proposal. The CEO spent $6 million on his recent birthday party. Like Enron, they're based in the Cayman Islands. And my question is this: what involvement will your office have in reviewing this proposal? And secondly, what would you say to the City Club related to having a special program related to this, given its significance?
My office, because I'm not the Public Utility Commission, my office won't have any specific legal review authority in terms of the purchase of PGE by this new firm. That review is done entirely by the Public Utility Commission. I do believe, it's none of my business really, but I do believe that would be a great City Club program to really get a better understanding about what this company is. We know some of the leaders or figureheads in the company include some very well-known people here who I have a lot of respect for, like Neil Goldschmidt, Tom Walsh. But the question still exists. Okay, that's great. Those are great people. How much control do those people have of this company? And I don't know the answer. I asked that without knowing the answer. So those are the kind of questions I think we need to get answers to.
Hi, Bill.
Hi.
Hi, Jane C., City Club member. I was trying to think of ways that you might reach young people with register to vote reminders, and it has your office, or for example the National Association of Secretaries of State, maybe had conversations with website places where young people access, so maybe talk about a non-spam pop-up reminder for votes, or some sort of a concept like that. It seems to me that's, I've been thinking of my own grandchildren. That's a place where you have access to young people, and maybe some sort of a thing like that that would be a public service kind of a thing. If somebody's legally downloading music or something, but anyhow, something. Have you thought about that?
Well, I have worked very closely, for example, with the Oregon Student Association, which is the student government at the university system, to register college students. But it's not just registering college students. I mean, that's part of it. That's the first step, because you run out, you have to do that 20 days before the election, because after that, you're out of luck. But the other challenge is to get young people to vote. And we had a wonderful experience in the 2000 election working with the Oregon Student Association, where over 22,000 students were new registrants and voters, not just registrants, but voters in Oregon. And those kinds of efforts, working closely with them, I've been on been on the U of O, OSU, PSU, Southern Oregon and Western Oregon and Eastern Oregon campuses recently to try to encourage those continued kind of efforts. We'd certainly look at other things like pop-ups. That's actually a good idea. We will look at that, things like that. Right.
Claire Krodowski, City Club member. Secretary Bradbury, we now know that there's been considerable signature fraud on petitions for ballot measures. And would you explain the process for validating signatures that makes it hard to find fraud, and what programs will be in the future for preventing fraud?
I think I would challenge your statement that it's hard to find fraud. I'm sure there's some fraud that exists, but I would challenge your statement that it's rampant. What goes on is that for example, the referendum on the tax increase has to be filed with our office by next Tuesday, and we will then do a entering of signatures and a random, I forget the percentage, but I think it's 5% the first time, 10% the second time. I'm not saying it quite right, but anyway, we'll then send out those signatures to the county clerks. They will confirm those signatures against the original voter registration card of that voter. There were a number of instances last year where initiatives that didn't have lots of extra signatures actually didn't end up getting on the ballot because of a lot of signatures being challenged. So there is a process that the counties go through to check the signatures, and people on both sides of the coin, both proponents and opponents, participate, can sit in with the county and observe, and then file complaints based on what they observe. And that's what they did in the last election cycle. And we saw a number of measures that were close not get on the ballot because of some of those challenges.
My name is Sharon Joy, City Club member. Any transaction I do, I get a receipt for it, except something as important as a vote. I just wondered if there's any possibility of doing that in case there's something goes wrong with the election, like counting again, when some of them are thrown away and things like that.
Well, here's the challenge. I hadn't thought about giving receipts. I'm not sure quite what good that would do. But the challenge is that when you're counting votes, you've got to separate who the voter is from how they voted. So you've got to have a process that allows the vote to enter the counting pool but no longer, once it's entered, once it's going to be counted, it can no longer be associated with a specific voter, because we can't, it has to be a private ballot. We can't know how any person voted. So you've got to make sure that you check whether they're a valid voter when you're counting it, and once you've figured out that they're a valid voter, and Oregon is one of the few places in the country that reviews every signature before a vote is put in the pool to be counted. Once that's happened, you can't have that ballot associated with a specific voter anymore.
There are ways, but okay.
Okay?
Bob Geary, member. I have a get out the vote question because I was a high school teacher. What we've recently told on the NewsHour, for instance, is it's not the students stupid, it's the teachers. What is your office doing to educate the teachers of social studies in whatever number of thousands of social studies teachers there are in this state?
I've been working with social studies and civics teachers around the state in the visits we make and the visits we're going to make, and I actually would say that the problem there is some problem that we've put our finger on and haven't really been able to deal with, which is given educational reform that's taken place in the schools, how much traditional civics is still being taught. I still remember my civics teacher in 7th grade. Her name was Mrs. Seymour, and I remember learning all about the balance of power and executive and legislative and judicial from that. And so it was I really think that's a wonderful experience, and I think it'd be a real tragedy if the education system doesn't provide similar opportunities to people. I have to tell you that I have been very impressed with the people who I've met in the various schools I've gone to. I've probably gone to 80 schools in the last couple of years. So I've been very impressed with them as good teachers who are really, their biggest concern is getting students involved, and virtually every one of them does some program that relates to getting kids to register to vote, right as they turn 18 or prior to turning 18. So I think there are some issues that need to be worked on further related to educational reform, but I don't think the problem is with the people who are the teachers, because my experience with them is it's been wonderful.
Amanda Bryan, City Club member.
Hi.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on Representative Dan Doyle's idea of putting the voters pamphlet online.
Well, putting the voters pamphlet, we do put the voters pamphlet online, and if that's all we did, which was what Representative Doyle was proposing, he actually, to be fair, he was proposing to put the voters pamphlet online and then send a postcard to everyone to see whether they wanted to receive it. Here's what you do. It's about 50% of the voters don't access the internet. Older voters hate the internet, okay? I'm sorry, they do. And so do low-income voters, so do minority voters, African Americans, Hispanics particularly, don't make use of the internet. So that basically the statistics are, if you rely just on the internet, you'd be saying to 50% of the people in the state, well, you don't get a voter's pamphlet, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the proposal was, well, let's send a postcard to everybody, and if they wanted, that we have this on the internet, and if they wanted to get one, they then could. Well, the fact is that a specifically addressed postcard would cost at least twice as much as it costs to send every household the voter's pamphlet, because we have worked out a wonderful deal with the post office. Because we include voter registration information in the voter's pamphlet, it's now considered I forget the exact word, but it's an election material thing that gets the lowest bulk rate. And it's literally half the cost of postage if you put a specific address on the voter's pamphlet. So through the efforts that we've undertaken in the last 4 years, we've reduced the cost of the voter's pamphlet and mailing it to people by 50%. Okay? But some of these ideas, like internet, which disenfranchises 50% of the people, or let's send a postcard to everybody, that would cost twice as much. So I think the system we have now is really a very cost-effective system that gets the information out. And we do put it on the internet too, if you want to get it there.
Justin Gottlieb, City Club member. This kind of follows on what you were just speaking about, but one thing, I love the vote by mail, but the thing that bothers me about it is when I go to send it in, I'm putting a 37-cent stamp on it, which is the equivalent of paying to vote, even with the drop sides. Why can't we do a bulk rail mate for the return back into the state?
We could, although given the hard time the state is having right now, I would have a hard time making the case that we needed to provide return postage instead of health care. Here's the reality, okay? The reality is that you used to drive or walk or whatever, probably drive to your polling place, and you probably spent more than 37 cents on gasoline to drive to your polling place. So I don't think it's an unreasonable burden to place on voters to ask them to put 37-cent stamp on a return ballot. So I think the system, I haven't seen any big sign that there's a huge body of people that aren't participating because they have to put postage on. I would confess I resent more when I have to pay a big bill and I have to put postage on it.
Thank you.
Marilyn Albert, City Club member. First of all, Mr. Bates kind of jumped the queue a little bit and asked me to acknowledge the students here from the New Progressive Movement.
Oh, great.
Thank you. My question is, it seems like it's all good news with regard to vote by mail. And so can you fill us in on some of the issues the legislators that you mentioned before have with the process?
Well, there are two big ones. One was there was a real effort, particularly in the House, not in the Senate, but there was a real effort in the House to shorten the period of time that ballots are in voters' hands. Right now, it's somewhere between, county clerks have to mail ballots 18 to 21 days before the election, which generally means that there will be 2 weekends that people will have their ballots. And if you live in Portland, if you put your ballot in the mail Monday, it'll be counted on Tuesday. But if you live in Langlois, Oregon, which I used to, put your ballot in the mail on Monday, it will be at the Eugene post office and might get back to Curry County Thursday. So shortening the time creates a real disadvantage, particularly for those who don't have, high-speed postal service, like the rural areas of this state. So that's a real, a real challenge. Is just to make sure that I don't see any reason. There's not any fraud problem. There's no problem with the length of time we have for people voting. So why shorten it and disadvantage particularly rural voters? And there was another issue that I took. What was it? I don't remember. But there was another issue. Forget.
I think we have time for one more question.
Guinevere Milius, City Club member. Secretary Bradbury, I was wondering if you could answer a question about the national election system. Wanted to know what you thought about how the Electoral College itself has affected people's opinion about the voting process, given that, you know, individual votes didn't actually count in the 2000 election.
Well, you know, I wrote a paper in 7th grade. I really did. About how you could win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College vote. And lo and behold, in the 2000 presidential election, they proved my paper. Here's what I believe about the Electoral College, is that the fact is that the Electoral College benefits smaller states. And that's who it benefits, us. It benefits smaller states like Oregon, it benefits smaller states like Rhode Island, it benefits smaller states like Montana. And the reason it benefits us is because your electoral votes are based on the total number of representatives you have in Congress, including your 2 U.S. senators. Every state has 2 U.S. senators, regardless of population. Wyoming has 1 congressperson and 2 U.S. senators. So the Electoral College gives some added weight to smaller states. But what else does it do? It guarantees that smaller states like Oregon will see the presidential candidates, because